So finally we come to layering, and layering is combining several materials or patterns to create your final result. So the basic three methods of doing this is layering materials, layering patterns, and layering in your paint program. Now software-wise, inside of Max, you'll probably be using stuff like the composite material, the blend material, the composite map, the mix map, and the mask map. And there's also a couple of Max plugins, Composite Mode by Michael Spa and Cyanic Comp by David Gohara. And these two plugins give you all of the standard Photoshop blend modes inside of Max. Now in Max 2009's composite map, they added all the Photoshop blend modes that were in these two plugins. However, this map still has a whole bunch of bugs. Like, for example, if you layer two bump maps together, it doesn't properly take the bumps and perform the proper operations to them. So until that gets fixed, I still recommend looking up either Composite Mode or Cyanic Comp. Here are some diagrams showing the three different ways to go about layering things together. So for the layering materials method, what you do is you create a metal material with a color bump and spec map, and you pretend like your entire material is going to be made of metal. And then you make a paint material the same way and pretend like your entire material is going to be made of paint. Then you do a rust material and pretend like your entire material is going to be made of rust. And then you paint mask maps. And what these are black and white maps that say, for example, this one will say anywhere that is white, for example, is going to be paint, and anywhere that's black is going to be metal. And then this mask map will say everything that's white is going to be rust, and everything that's black is going to be your combination of your paint and metal materials. And then these layer together to form your final material. So for the layering patterns method, it's very similar, except instead of layering materials together, you're going to layer the separate patterns that you have from the previous example. So for example, you take the rust color, the paint color, and the metal color. And the rust color, you use the mask for the rust here, and then you use the mask for the paint here. And these get combined, and then these combine with the color and another set of layers for the bump and another set of layers for the spec to form your final material. Then lastly is the layering in a paint program method, which is similar to the previous example, except instead of doing your layering in your 3D program, you do your layering in your paint program using masks, again, on the different layers. And then these guys combine together to form a single color map, which is then read in your 3D program in your final material. So let's do a practical example. So for this example, I'm going to take a metal material, and I'm going to layer rust on top of it using the three different methods I mentioned before. So to start off, let's take a peek at the bitmaps we'll use. So this is going to be the chrome environment map for the metal. Then this is going to be the metal bump. This is going to be the metal color, the metal spec. Then this is going to be the rust bump, the rust color, and the rust spec, which you see is very dark because rust is not a very reflective surface. And then finally, this is going to be our mask. And the mask is going to be white everywhere that there's rust, and it's going to be black everywhere that it's going to be metal. So we'll start with layering materials. So you can see here this material is applied to this cylinder, and it's a blend material, and the first slot has a metal material, and the second slot has a rust material. So the metal has my metal color, my metal bump, and my metal spec with the environment map, and the rust has the rust color, the rust bump, and the rust spec. And you can see just this by itself is a completely rusty material. And same down here, this by itself is just a purely metal material. And then the mask is the rust mask I showed you, which is the black and white map that says where is going to be metal and where is going to be rust. So this is a little bit less about painting materials and more about painting masks to reveal materials. And has several advantages. First of all, it's nicely split into separate materials. So if you need to go and change something about your metal, or you have a metal from somebody else that you want to use, you can just drop it into the slot. So the stuff is very nicely compartmentalized. Also, each material can have a different shader. So for example, this guy here, you'd probably want to leave as the Brazil default shader, but For your rust, you might want your rust to be rougher, and so you might choose the Ornair shader. And it's really easy to do that because you have two completely separate shaders that you can play with instead of only having one material. And the other thing is, if you want to swap out any of these, maybe like the metal bump, if you want to swap it out with some sort of procedural, it's real easy to do because all your mixing is happening at the in the 3D program. Now, it does have some disadvantages. First of all, is it's slower to render than the other methods because you have two materials that are being blended. So it has to calculate the whole metal, then it has to calculate the whole rust, and then it has to merge them together. Sometimes this is a noticeable speed difference, and sometimes it's not, but it's definitely worth knowing that it'll probably render a little slower. And then second is, it's sort of hard to visualize your final result in your paint program. Because in your paint program, all you're going to be doing is you're going to be painting the mask here. And so, you know that, well, white is going to be rust and black is going to be no rust, but you don't really get a full interactive view as you paint in here of what it's going to look like. You have to do your changes, and then you have to save this file, and then you have to reload it here, and then you have to hit render again to see what your final result is going to look like. Next comes layering patterns. So this is where you take your separate maps and you combine them in a single material. So for example, in this Brazil 2 Advanced material, I have in the color a mix map, and in here I have the metal color and I have the rust color, and then I use my rust mask to blend between these two, and then the result of that gets plugged into the color of the material. And the same for the bump. So in the bump I have the metal bump and I have the rust bump, and these are combined with that mask that I showed you. And then this result is plugged into the bump slot. So the big advantage of this method is that it's probably faster to render because you only have a single material and you don't have two materials that need to be evaluated. However, it has a number of disadvantages. First of all, it's a little harder to visualize in the material editor. So if you want to change something specific to the metal, you have to first ask yourself the question, okay, well, what part of the metal do I want to change? Is it going to be the color? And if you want to go for the color, then you have to go into this color section rather than having it split out into materials. And that might be fine, but personally my brain thinks more in terms of materials than in terms of the different maps. So the first thing I would think of is to look under a material rather than to look under one of the patterns in the material. And second of all, because it's only one shader, you're a little bit limited on being able to blend between multiple shaders. And so your results might look a little more bland than if you have two completely separate shaders that you can use. And then finally, it has the same problem that layering materials had, and that is that in your paint program, it's sort of tough to visualize what the results are going to look like. You're always going to have to be saving out copies of your masks and then hitting render in order to see what the result is. And finally, here's layering inside of the paint program. So I have here in Photoshop a single PSD, and it has 3 different folders for the different attributes. And here, for example, is my color. So I have my metal color, then I have my rust color, and I then have a mask, which is here, which is the black and white mask map that I had. And then I have the same thing here for the bump, and the same thing for the spec. So what I do is I take this entire color once I'm done, and I save this out as a single file, and then I bring it into Photoshop. So this color file here is the combination of these 2 layers inside of Photoshop. So the big advantage of doing it this way is that if you paint on your mask in Photoshop, you can see immediately what the result is going to look like without having to go into the 3D program and hit render. But this has a lot of disadvantages, and the first disadvantage is that Photoshop is not a procedural program, so if I make changes to this mask, really I also want this mask to change with it, but it won't do it automatically. I have to manually copy it, so I'd have to select this and do a Control-C, and then go up to this level, and then do a Control-V to paste it, and now they're the same. But then I have to also go to the spec, and I have to do the same thing. And if you're doing a lot of tweaks, doing this over and over and over again can be really annoying. And so it takes a lot of time to copy stuff between the different layers. If Photoshop was a little more procedural and allowed you to link those masks together, then you wouldn't have this problem. Also, in the 3D side of things, if you want to change just the metal material color, for example, you can't do that in your 3D app. You have to go back to Photoshop in order to do it, and then load in a new map. Also, like the previous layering patterns, you can only use a single shader. You can't use multiple shaders since it's only one material. And also, if, say, you want to take the metal bump map and you want to turn it into a procedural instead of a bitmap, you can't do that because all your layering is happening over here in Photoshop. And so you can't replace little pieces of it in 3D with some other map. So none of these three methods are perfect. Each one has advantages and disadvantages. And so which one you choose to do should depend on what is your personal preference and also what is easier to do for the particular job you're trying to do. Personally, I sort of do a hybrid approach. So I like the materials method because I like the idea of having these sort of like this is a full material and this is a full material and then blending between them with a mask. But what I'll do is instead of in Photoshop painting on a black and white map, what I'll do is I'll set up something similar to this as though I were going to do my mixing at the Photoshop level. And then I'll do my changes so I get the instant feedback in Photoshop. But instead of saving this out as a color map, what I'll do is I'll go over here and I'll save this mask out as the mask, which then blends between the two different materials. So it's just my little way of trying to get the best of both worlds with layering materials and at the same time getting the instant feedback that the layering in Photoshop provides you.